the 1800RESPECT logo appears, the National Sexual Assault Domestic Family Violence Counselling Service. Underneath are images of women and children and 2 women in a counselling situation. Some text reads, "The information presented in this webinar is of a general nature and is not a substitute for legal or other professional advice. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily represent the views of the Australian Government or MHS. While all reasonable care has been taken in the preparation of this presentation, no liability is assumed for any errors or omissions." Text appears. Responding is everyone's business.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's 1800RESPECT webinar. Before we start, I would like to pay my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting takes place, and also pay respect to elders both past and present. Today's topic is a trauma-informed understanding and responses to children affected by family violence. We're pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Angela Weller. Angela is a social worker currently working as the Manager of Child Trauma Service for the Australian Childhood Foundation, and we're very lucky and pleased to have her. This service provides specialist counselling for children and their families that have experienced trauma. Angela's background includes child protection, child and adolescent mental health, and family therapy. Exploring recent research and knowledge, Angela will provide an insight into how family violence shapes children's development, including the impacts on children's brain, body, emotion, behaviour and relationships. It's bound to be a very interesting and topical webinar today, and we're pleased to say we have approximately 1,500 participants registered for this webinar. Now please note the webinar is live and interactive. You're encouraged to participate by posing questions which can be typed into the chat box located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Now I encourage you to write all your questions in there, and we will endeavour to answer as many as we possibly can at the end of today's webinar. There'll be approximately 10 to 15 minutes question and answer time at that time. So finally, if you are experiencing difficulty hearing the sound during the webinar, please dial the 1800 support number that is listed in the chat box. I'm now very pleased to pass over to Angela to begin today's webinar.
Thank you, Kelly. It's really exciting to be here for a range of reasons. One, I've never spoken to this many people ever before in my life, so I'm very pleased to be talking to so many of you about something that is really very important, I think, in the current context of our Royal Commission in Victoria, and certainly also it's been an area of incredible interest for me in my work, and so I always very much enjoy having an opportunity to share my thoughts with you all, and I will be really interested to hear your thoughts and your questions and some of your reflections at the end of the webinar. So just to say that my interest in a child's experience of family violence has come from many years of working with children using a children's rights and trauma framework at the Australian Childhood Foundation. More recently, I've been involved as a sector representative for children in a regional family violence partnership, and no doubt many of you would be involved or know of those sort of partnerships. I've been involved in the Eastern region. This local partnership has responsibility for providing an integrated service delivery model to women, children and men. In this, it has been really important for me to consider the specific needs of children within a system that I don't believe has historically understood or prioritised them in the context of family violence. I think we've needed to work on a very specific understanding of what exactly it means for them. In my history of being a counsellor with children who've experienced a range of abuse, my sense of family violence is it has a hugely significant impact on children in all areas of their development, and that's the impetus for me to understand this in a very specific evidence-based and researched way. A colleague said to me several years ago, wouldn't it be great if every child who's experienced family violence could receive a response that would meet their needs, whether it's a child at school, whether it's a child in receiving counselling, a child in a refuge, a child feel with their family? And that was a really important question for me, because whilst I know that that's kind of in some ways unrealistic, it led me to get thinking about what we really need to do to understand the specific impact of family violence on children, and how we think about what they need, and how as professional service systems, parents, carers, we can respond to them. So that's the background and context of it. And if I go on to the first slide, I would like to sort of, I think Kelly said this as well, but today really is going to be about a conversation about what family violence does to children, and consider what a child needs and as a result of that. The experience of family violence is a significant source of trauma for children. Recent research and knowledge provides an insight into how family violence shapes children's development, including impacts on their brain, body, emotion, behaviour and relationships. And I'll go through each of those areas, those domains, those components of a child's functioning, because it's a really useful map to understand what it is and how we see the impacts in children. Integrating the knowledge base of neurobiology and attachment in this webinar will provide us with an understanding of the impacts of family violence and an overview of interventions in the context of the child's culture, relationships, community and the professional system around them. I think now would be a good time perhaps to do a short poll, because one of the questions that is often asked to me is, what is it particularly like for children to live in an environment that is shaped by violence? Is this different for them than adults? So the poll question that I'm going to ask you is the experience of family violence for children different to that of their mothers and other adults? Oh, that's a very resounding yes. So I think we could probably stop the poll now, and I'll just kind of comment about that. I guess what you would all say to that is that, of course, it's different. But one of the things that we know is that a lot of people don't think that it is, because I think that there's been a lot of emphasis on the experience for adults and in particular mothers, and we have a range of frameworks that understand, structural and gendered frameworks that help us to understand the impact on a woman. And there are similarities, there certainly are, because it's frightening, it's abusive, it's disempowering for both adults, both mothers and children. But we make some assumptions around the fact that if children are too young, they're not affected. If they didn't see it, they weren't affected. If they were in another room, it didn't matter. If they weren't directly hit. So I think that what I've done is explore something of the concept of witnessing family violence and really thinking about it as experiencing family violence for children, because they too are involved in the frightening, terrifying experience of never knowing what's going to happen next in their family. The other thing that's very different for children is that developmentally they're too young to understand it. They can't make meaning of it. They can't make decisions around what to do about it. They need adults to protect them, and they often don't have those adults. So I guess it feels really important in leading up to this webinar and this conversation to differentiate some of the developmental, social, legal needs of children that sit both similarly but separate to their mothers. And in understanding those different needs, we're in a position to support them and understand them. So that's just a first poll. So I'd like to go on to my next slide, which is family violence as trauma. Trauma theory, as most of you will have heard, has become a primary explanatory framework for understanding and responding to the needs of children. Trauma is the emotional, psychological and physiological residue that remains in children after the violence and the abuse. We know that it stays with children, and part of the conversation we have around these different parts of the child's brain and body will help to explain why there is a residual effect, why even when it's stopped it doesn't go away for children, why years later they can still feel a reverberation of fear through their bodies. And even after they've been told it's safe, sometimes it doesn't feel like it for them. Children are particularly vulnerable to trauma as a result of their developmental, social and relational immaturity. I'm going to go through a framework that outlines the specific areas of impact, and that's on your screen now, which is the brain, the body, emotion, behaviour, relationships and loss. When we think about neurobiology and trauma, the authors that we think of, and I'd encourage all of you to look at some of the writings and the research from these authors, is Dan Siegel, Alan Shaw, Steve Porges, Pat Ogden, Dan Hughes, Bruce Perry. There are many current researchers that provide us with a great deal of information around trauma and its impact on the neurobiology of brain and brain development. Most of this material is written for adults, but our job, and I guess my vision with this material, is to translate a lot of what's been written for adults into the way we understand children and their needs. Normative brain development tells us that a brain develops sequentially and is integrated in a way that enables us to function from basic physical survival like breathing and walking and heart rate to complex emotional and cognitive capacities. Our brain's primary function is to receive, interpret and integrate sensory data. So what we see, smell, touch, taste, hear, all of that comes into our brain and we make sense of that. We survive, we communicate with people, we talk, we make meaning, we learn. That's our brain's job. But trauma is disintegrative to brain development. Trauma disintegrates, affects the size of particular parts of the brain. It disintegrates the integrative components of the brain. So bits of the brain that need to talk to each other, need to communicate, are not able to. So hence the important things like meaning making and emotional feelings and communication become very compromised. So trauma reduces the capacity of children's brains to shape the way they react to the environment. They can't perceive things safely. They don't feel like they understand things. They don't find relationships safe. They cannot react in safe and flexible ways to different situations and contexts. What our brain helps us to do is have a set of flexible responses to the environment. Like if a snake comes up to us, we know how to respond to that, or perhaps we don't, but we can react flexibly in terms of thinking, managing our arousal and having an action plan around things that we need to survive and things that we need to know. Children cannot react in those safe ways. They can't react flexibly, so they're stuck in very inflexible, frightened ways of being because their brains are so overactivated, they're so stressed. They struggle to remain calm enough to take in new information and learn new things. The parts of their brains, like the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that is fundamentally important for our memory, doesn't function properly. So children can't remember what they heard a minute ago, let alone a month ago or a year ago or 2 years ago. Their autobiographical memory systems are affected. Their capacity to tell us a story about where they were, how they were, what they felt, who they were with, and their sensory impressions of that situation are really compromised. What that does is have people suggest or interpret their behaviour and the way they are as problematic. Because they can't memorize things, they get labelled as liars. Because they can't learn, they get labelled as poor learners or having behaviour problems. So there are particular parts of the brain that are compromised in terms of their arousal, their stress, their capacity to remember and to remain calm, that keep them in a hypervigilant state all the time. They find it difficult to separate the past from the present, so they're constantly reacting to sensory triggers and other unconscious reminders of the past as if they are in the present. These kids are always looking out for something to be frightened of, even though they might be safe, which goes back to that sense of what I said before, is that even after the fear has passed, we have got and we see kids who still find the world frightening. The theory that best explains the link between the brain and the body is the polyvagal theory, and many of you may have heard this, and this is a theory by Stephen Porges. This theory clearly connects the brain and the autonomic nervous system through the body to explain the physiological impacts of trauma. It describes as survival mechanisms defensive responses that we use to protect ourselves from threat. And I think when we think about those defensive mechanisms, we can probably relate to those ourselves. Sometimes if we're stressed, we become highly anxious. You would have heard of the fight, flight, freeze response. That is where we run, we fight, we run away, we defend in a very active, perhaps even angry, anxious way, a response to when we don't feel safe. Trauma orients a child to become activated and fight to stay away from things that are not safe. Alternatively, they can shut down, they can become dissociative, they might seem like they're not present. That again is a protective response to survive what is unbearable fear, either in the present or how they're perceiving the re-triggering of fear responses in them. The problem with this, obviously there are problems with neither response enables a child to feel safe enough to be connected or comforted in a relationship. And Porges would say that there's another state that we need to be in, which is around social engagement. That is where we feel safe enough, and our neuroception of safety, the way we see and feel the world, makes us safe enough to connect with others to feel safe. You think of the kids we see them running, fighting, fleeing, freezing, or shutting down to just protect themselves from the fear. So the brain-body system becomes stuck in a hypervigilant state, constantly scanning the environment for threat. And we see this in children, the way they look like frightened, scared, hyperactive little people, big people. Any change is experienced as a threat and can trigger a physiological or overwhelming stress response, because as I said before, their neurobiological and nervous systems are not flexible enough to make sense of the current situation, and so they are feeling frightened and they are triggered into fear responses, hypervigilant responses. Their bodies and muscles, Pat Ogden talks about procedural tendencies. Their bodies and muscles are formed into a state that they sometimes look small, they look frightened, they have to be procedurally ready to manage the fear or the stress that they're about to have in their life. So their bodies, their muscles are oriented to protection but not oriented to safety or connection with others. Their developmental trajectories are altered and delayed, and they're more vulnerable to physiological vulnerabilities such as illnesses. You see a lot of these kids missing school because they're sick. Their immune systems are compromised because it's all part of the physiological impact of trauma on their brain-body system. I think when we see and think about children and feelings, the experiences of violence and unpredictable and fear affect their capacity to know and organise their emotional world and develop emotional awareness and literacy. Children, and Alan Shaw talks about this, need in their younger years a strong connection with a parent, a caregiver that has innately in it right brain connection. In that connection, they first of all receive experiences of co-regulation, relational regulation, where when their own systems of regulation aren't working, they can rely on someone who is close to them to help them to calm down. What happens in their brain is that they then develop systems that enable them to self-regulate. This experience of brain development in terms of emotional regulation is what enables children to develop an emotional world. They can develop feelings, they can develop an awareness of their own feelings, they look to others to interpret their feelings, they feel safe to empathise with others. These children miss out on that because what they're often doing is that they don't have adult caregivers that are able to, because of the level of violence and need to survive in their family, cannot provide them with that congruent care. And that's not to be blaming of mothers in this or anyone in particular. My thoughts around this is that just so often mothers aren't available to their children to provide that experience because they are so traumatised and frightened and trying to survive themselves. And in the experience of violence, fathers separate out, or men separate out women and children's capacity to do that regulatory, co-regulatory growth and experience. So children become disconnected from their feelings, they can't acknowledge emotional states, they can't trust their external world and relationships to acknowledge, value or empathise with their feelings. I think the other thing to say is anger is often expressed as the safest emotion because it's easier, like as I said before, to fight, to flee. It's much easier to be angry with someone, to be sad. You feel so much less vulnerable in an angry state. Your brain is more robust in an angry state than it is a sad state. One of the things that children and women feel enormously in this family violence experience is shame. Shame is possibly the most toxic emotional experience because if you think about how hard it is to feel and tell something shameful, it is really hard for these children to feel shame. They shouldn't feel shame, but their experience and the messages they're given by people around them, their fathers, is that it's their fault. And children are fairly egocentric in the world. They feel like they're at the heart of things. They feel like they're at the heart of the meaning of the world. If someone constantly tells them it's their fault, they will believe that. So they develop a sense of shame. And as I said, shame is a really, really difficult emotion to cope with or process. So that's hence why we see so much anger in these children and so much sadness that they feel has to be translated into something that's safer to express. Behaviour I was referred to is the way we see a lot of what I've talked about there. We see and we know that neurobiology gives an explanation for what we see in children, their fear, their hypervigilance, their lack of emotional connection. But what we see in them is behaviour, and the important thing about behaviour is that we need to understand it. I think so often behaviour, trauma-based behaviour is interpreted as being bad or naughty or lying or deceitful. We know that children's emotional parts of their brain don't even develop until they're 3 or 4. So how can a child be lying at that age? We need to understand the neurobiology. We also need to understand what's at the heart of trauma-based behaviours. Trauma behaviours are adaptive, and when I mean adaptive is a really important word. Children learn to adapt to feeling frightened by developing certain behaviours to survive. The problem with those behaviours is they're really helpful at the time that they need to use them to survive, but they're no longer helpful a year, 2 years later. But because their memory systems and because their systems are stuck in that hypervigilant mode, they still need those behaviours as ways that they think they need to cope with difficulties in relationships, difficulties in learning, difficulties in just functioning. So if we understand trauma-based behaviours as adaptive and just that the child has had to do them. I just want to tell you a little story quickly because I know I need to keep an eye on the time, but a boy we're working with at the moment who goes home every night and he stands at the front door of his house and he has to be there by 5 because at 5 o'clock his dad comes home and he has to listen at 5 o'clock to whether or not there are 7 shuffled steps or 7 clear steps. If there are 7 clear steps, it means Dad hasn't been drinking and that he will come inside and things will be okay. If those steps are shuffled, it means Dad has been drinking and there's going to be a lot of violence that evening. What this little boy has to do then, once he determines what the level and nature of the steps are, is to go inside and reorganise things so his siblings are in rooms, his mother's in a certain place, dinner's on the table. He has to manage the safety of that environment. That is his adaptive survival strategy. What that means for him, though, is he has to think about this all day at school every day because he never knows what those steps are going to sound like. He can't go anywhere to play after school. He can't focus on homework. He has to have very good ears. So if he's got a cold, what does he do? Because he's got to be able to determine these steps. He's got to take responsibility for his family in that moment. This takes the opportunity for this child to do all the things that an 8-year-old needs to do in his day and after school and with his friends. That's an example of adaptive behaviour, and we will see that over and over in children's functioning. But it does only make sense in the context that it's first developed. This child will probably go home and stand at the front door every night for the next few years unless we find some way of helping him be safe not to, even when it is safe to. So as I've just said, it appears as patterns or repetitive routines that play themselves out in relationships environments. The only thing is people don't understand them, so they interpret them as maladaptive and bad. That's a really important point, and I would really like for people to kind of think about the children you work with and think about whether or not you can develop a greater level of understanding of adaptive survival functions in the children you see. It becomes embedded in their identities, how they're shaped, interpreted by themselves and others. Let's go on to trauma and relationships. I think, I've talked a lot about relationships in the context of brain development, but children fundamentally need secure connections to allow them to explore the world. Attachment theory tells us that. Neurobiological theory tells us that. As a parents, we know that. We know that children just need to be held and given constant messages of safety, security, attunement, nurturing. But when they're in relationships that are corrupted by fear and threat, relationships develop in a different way. They form relational templates that are based on fear, disconnection, loneliness, isolation. And as I said before, the relationship with their mother is significantly damaged with the fragmentation and fear separating the child from what they need from their mother. Their mothers say to me all the time, I was so separate from what I knew my child needed because I was so frightened and I was just trying to survive, and I was constantly told that I was a bad mother and that I didn't know what I was doing, and all of those critical messages that become embedded in a mother's identity. The next thing that is really important for children, and this is kind of in some ways, an interesting, complex and controversial area in terms of family violence and children, but their relationships with the perpetrators of violence are also intense and complicated and confusing for them. I'm wondering about whether or not you could put up the next poll question now, and we'll just have a bit of a talk about that. Is that going up? No?
Cass? There it is.
Oh, there it is. Okay, here's my question. Do fathers have a fundamental right to have an ongoing relationship with their child after the violence, even if there's been a change in the living situation or contact? This is interesting because we've got a kind of a hovering equalness about this, and I would like to just 53-46 for those that are interested in actual sort of can we stop the poll? Because I think, again, I would like to just acknowledge the complexity of this. But my sense of working with children and their families in terms of family violence is that their relationship with their fathers is very complex. And whilst I think it's right to say that anyone who is violent to a child, be it a man, woman, community, teacher, anyone, can and should, perhaps their rights to contact with their child should change, and we should have legal contexts that provide safety to children when they are not safe. However, what I've found is that children, at a minimum, need to make sense of the relationship with their father or the perpetrator of the violence. I'm using the word father as a generalised, the perpetrator of the violence, be it stepfather, father, other people. They need to, at a minimum, make sense of the violence. Because they don't just forget they have the father, they don't forget what happened to them. They need someone to help them make sense of that. They need to have someone to help them make sense of why someone who supposedly loved them would be like that to them. They need to make sense of how that relationship is no longer available to them. They need to experience the loss in that. And so whilst this feels like it's always complicated to say, what I do in my practice is try and understand how, at a minimum, as I said, that children are supported to make sense of all those questions and confusion, and if possible, to have contact with their father in a safe way that can involve a father or a perpetrator acknowledging the violence and saying sorry and creating a new safe way of being with their child. I do working. In fact, I was at a men's behaviour change group last night, and my emphasis with men who have been violent to children is that you need to take responsibility for the violence. You need to say that to your child. You need to talk about the importance of safety, and you need to repair this with your child. So in conclusion, I guess we can't just leave children without that sense of meaning making, but we also have to protect them. So that's been an issue for me in a service that is a child-focused service, because we, at times, we do need to consider the role of fathers in our work, but we only do it safely. That might be a source of questions at the end. I'm not sure. I'd like to finish that framework in terms of loss. This is a sort of a concept that I think is a really big one for kids, because kids lose a lot when they experience family violence. They lose things that we don't even think about as adults. They lose safety and they lose connection. They lose what's predictable and familiar. They lose their family, their school, their belongings, and their sense of community. And they lose a sense of hope. But I saw a little boy the other day that said, Angela, I had a teddy that I took to bed every night, and he helped me go to sleep, but I had to leave him because we had to leave our crisis accommodation in a really big hurry, and I'm never going to see him again. How am I going to sleep? Do we actually understand in ourselves? I don't know. That sounds funny, doesn't it? I'm wondering if we understand what it's like for a child to lose even the smallest things that we don't even understand but might have incredible meaning to them. So children lose a lot, and how I think about reparation for children is how can we help children find some of the things, some of the experiences, some of the people that feel like have been lost to them. And in terms of loss, from an Aboriginal perspective, the causes of family violence are located in the history and impacts of colonisation and structural violence, the loss of land, the breakdown of community kinship systems, the removal of children. Therefore, in Aboriginal community, with Aboriginal children and families and communities I work with, I see family violence as a disconnection of children from their culture. I don't think that some of our gendered limbs, our structural ways, our ideas of power and control are always helpful when we think about an Aboriginal child's experience of trauma. I see the disconnection for these children, from the meanings associated with their beliefs and their community. I see the disconnection from cultural principles as maps to understand relationships in the world. And I see the disconnection from an experience and understanding of belonging to resources, rituals, history, stories, land. So when I talk a little bit about intervention, what I think is really important is to understand the loss in the context of colonisation and experience, the historical experience of loss for Aboriginal children, families and culture. So that's, I guess, quite a detailed explanation of what I think is the impact of family violence on children, and I think that it's a useful framework when I think about how it helps us to shape and think about intervention. And intervention, I think, should flow from the needs that are identified during an assessment of the impact of family violence. If we see particular areas of damage or disconnection or compromise in a child's regulatory system or their emotional system or their relational system, if we see particular areas of behaviour that we think that need to be understood in terms of neurobiological framework, how do we think about intervention? So I think components of intervention relate to work that is done with children, their mothers, their families, the communities and the system around them. And in the Eastern region, in the partnership I work with, we've developed a practice framework called Safe and Secure, which is really what this framework is that I'm talking to you today about, and you can access that. I'll talk to you about that a bit later. But one of the quotes from that, I think this is kind of a metaphorical look of what children need. It says safety and security spreads in concentric circles around children affected by family violence, locating the basis of change in their relationships with their mother, their siblings, their father, their extended family, their community and their friends. So if we picture a child in the middle of a system and then think about the concentric circles that spread and grow and develop around them, that are all influenced by our understanding of the impact and understanding of what they need to feel safe and connected. Because I think at the heart of this theory, at the heart of intervention for children, what they need is experiences of regulation in relationship. They need to feel calm, they need to feel physically safe in connected relationships. That's what they need. How do we help a system to understand how they provide those experiences with and for children? So, as I said, the service system needs to engage with children to provide a map for their recovery and reconnection to hope in their lives. It has some components, and one said, what does it look like for children? I'm going to go through some of the components and part of these are practical and part of these are systemic, part of these are things you do directly with children, but largely what they do as advocates for children as well, because the concentric circles taking our role as advocates in systems, as people who work directly with mothers and children, and people who work directly with children at the heart of the child's world. So what we do need to do is understand the dynamics of family violence. And as I said before, I think we do understand family violence and should understand family violence through a gendered lens as an abuse of power to consolidate control over women and children. That's the fundamental ideological, conceptual framework that I think that we use to understand family violence when we work with women and children. I think, therefore, how do we consider strategies for services, legal reforms that hold men accountable for their violence and resource them to make the necessary changes for safety to be sustained? We do need legal systems that protect women and children. We need child protection systems that understand this. We need to understand what power and control means to women and children as you deconstruct it in relationships with them, so they can start to take on more of that themselves, more autonomous sense of power and control in their own lives and hearts and relationships. We need to, as I've said, ensure that cultural considerations are built into all forms of intervention. We need to respect and honour cultural needs and make sure they're built into all of our work with children. We need to understand cultural meanings of childhood, of safety, of family. We need to make sure that we work together as and with services that are specifically oriented towards healing and recovery for families and communities. These are really important components. I think protection and safety for the child is around resourcing mothers to protect the child themselves and their children. It involves safety plans, it involves the legal system, the professional system, and intervention that focuses on physiological safety. I think children need to feel safe to recover, and I know that a lot of children don't, and a lot of people who talk to me say, how can children recover if they're still exposed to experiences of fear because they are, because for all sorts of reasons they can't be safe. But my orientation is that unless a child starts to experience some safety in the world, the recovery, the settling of their neurobiological and body systems will not begin to happen. So therefore, as an advocate for children, this framework, I believe, can be communicated into legal child protection and other systems that talks to the absolute heart of the importance of safety for children in their worlds. I think network engagement and collaboration is incredibly important, and that involves a collaborative approach by agencies to support joint planning, assessment, risk management and intervention. And I think all of us are involved in professional systems around children. How do we communicate with one another? What protocols do we have in place? How do we ensure that our risk assessment frameworks line up, that we're having conversations that are congruent around our understandings of behaviour that children show us? How do we, as agencies that even work not necessarily in partnership with each other, share a framework that keeps children central, that keeps the idea of accountability and safety central to our approach? I think when I say collective consideration and work as being mediated and communicated through structures such as care teams is one of the best ways of doing it. I rarely have a case of a child without there being a care team or other collaborative process with a set of protocols and communication structures and risk management plans and evaluative mechanisms to ensure that we are working together. Because, you know, at the very heart of family violence is neurobiological disintegration. If you take your concentric circles idea or metaphor, disintegration that happens in a child's brain reverberates out into their relationships, systems and communities. Disintegration happens everywhere. How do we integrate? How do we be integrated in our approach? One of these approaches, one of these ideas is around collaboration at a network level. In strengthening relational connections around the child, I could talk for another couple of hours around this, but I probably won't, because this is the very most important thing that I think children need is how do we have and empower people around children to help them to feel connected? What do children need to locate themselves in relationships that are safe, that give them messages of safety, that are committed to them, that say, I'm not leaving you, that are attuned to their feelings, that show them in an empathic way that they are understood and cared for. Dan Hughes has a beautiful theory or acronym called PACE, and he uses this with adults and children, and it stands for playfulness. I'm going to forget that now. That's funny, isn't it? Playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. If I think about working with a parent and a child, I think about how do we play with, how are we going to play together? How are we going to show empathy to your child? How are we going to be curious about what they feel, what their experience is, what their behaviour means? And how are we going to show empathy? Acceptance might have been the one that I went empathy first. Maybe I'm not so good at acronyms. But acceptance is I'm going to accept you for who you are, even though there are so many times that you show me that things are hard for you and you are worried about yourself and how you are. He says that the thing that a child needs in their life is to see an adult looking at them with acceptance. How do we help people around children to show acceptance to children, curiosity, empathy and care? There are lots of ways that I think about doing that when I'm with parents, mothers and children, by playing with them, by having conversation with them, but in the context of where you are, in your environment, in your agencies, as child protection workers, as mental health workers, I think it's important, the most important thing for children to feel those qualities of relationship in the people around them, that capacity to be held safely and with regulation. I think that we have another poll question now that we might need to ask, which is one that all people ask me a little bit about. Developmentally children and adolescents show this experience differently. We've got the question being, many adolescents display violence within their families and become known as offenders and perpetrators. Is this language and way of describing these people appropriate? Overwhelmingly, no. I think that's absolutely right, and I think that might seem, again, sort of obvious, but you have no idea how many times that I hear people talking about 14, 15-year-old boys and girls who are displaying violence or sexualised behaviours in their family as perpetrators or offenders. My strong belief is that we need to apply this developmental attachment and trauma framework and behavioural analysis of children as a way of understanding why they're displaying violence. Children copy what they see. They model what they know. They do what's familiar. Familiarity is the safest thing for children, even if familiarity is frightening. So why wouldn't they become violent? Part of that fight-flight response I described before in a child's nervous system is around becoming aggressive to protect oneself. So how do we understand these children as being vulnerable but showing aggression as their behavioural adaptation? So that's why I put that there, that question, and whilst it's sort of probably obvious in a way, I think as I move around the system, I hear so much of these young people being labelled in ways that I think is unhelpful to their ongoing identities and relationships, because that way of identifying and describing children is unhelpful to them. If they see themselves as an offender, why wouldn't they take that into their very first romantic relationship? Why wouldn't they see themselves as a perpetrator in every part of their life? It's so unhelpful for children. I think children need to make sense of what's happened to them. And I think, as I said before, children don't get the opportunity to often understand what's happened, why it's happened. Is it their fault? Why is it that someone can be so frightening in their family? None of their friends seem to have this experience. Why do I feel like it's my fault? But I can't talk to anyone about this because I'm actually quite embarrassed about this, or I feel some shame about this. And if I even talk about it, it makes me frightened. So how do we find safe adults in a child's world to help them to make sense of it? How do we challenge the views that children have that say, it's my fault just because I was told that 20 times, I was told it every night, I think it's my fault. We need to, as adults, say to these children, it's not your fault. How many different ways can I tell a child, show a child, make genuine to a child the fact that it is never your fault that this happened in your family? Because we know that even if they're silently held, those attributions live in the brains and the hearts of children. So How do we help them? We help them by getting them to talk about what's happened to them, how frightening it has been. Sometimes children can't talk about it because it's too hard. Sometimes they just need experience of safety and security in terms of their recovery process. Some theorists say it's important to go through, to actually talk about it, to go through it, to get through it, because you need to process it, you need to make sense of it. I don't know about whether every child needs to talk about it and say what it felt like and get the sort of somatic experiences, body-based experiences sort of understood for them. But I do know that children need to know that it's not their fault, and that adults all around them in those circles need to find some way of helping them to make sense of it. And finally, I think that children need to be helped to go on with their lives in a way that feels like they can get on with their development. I think trauma theory tells us that abuse can stop a child's developmental trajectory. And so when we look to the history of trauma, often we can see compromises that happen at particular points in time. And Bruce Perry would talk about this in his neurosequential model. He would say if a child's abused at the age of 3, well, we will see particular functions of that abuse in their behaviour and their functioning. They need to be able to get on with the tasks of being a child, to play, to feel safe, to grow, to develop, to have friends, to learn, to go to youth club, to do the stuff that children do. So they need ongoing integrative relational developmental experiences, and we need to support them with that by consolidating the things that we've done with them, with their mum, with their dad potentially, with their community, just to let them know that really that the normal developmental opportunities and hope for them as a child is available to them. So in terms of outcomes of intervention, I think that as a Victorian legislative framework, we have the best interest framework, and that's safety, stability and development. That is sort of overarches, in a sense, what I've spoken about today, in that if we are aiming to provide safety for children, we do it in various ways. Stability is felt in their bodies, their world, it's felt in their relationships, and it's felt by their ongoing development. I think in terms of what children can feel, I think it's important that they feel safe and they feel secure in their relationships, they feel cared for. I think that they need to feel like they've made some sense of their experiences, and they can feel a future sense of belonging and hope. And if I think about children that I work with and I see, there are so many ways that tell me that children have lost that sense of hope. And if we think about it, how does a child hold on to hope? How do they get a sense of hope in the first place? A sense of hope is offered to them by those around them, but I think children are naturally playful, hopeful, imaginative, metaphorical beings. They develop with a sense of openness to change and opportunity. They belong to a set of beliefs that tell them that things are possible in their world. So when family violence hurts them, that hope diminishes, and we see that time and time again. My strong feeling around this is that if we can find the words, a narrative, experiences that hold hope as possible, that hold play, acceptance, belonging as possible in a child's world, in their relationships, their community, their school, they can go on to feel like life is okay. And I think that the children that we see, as I said at the start of this, are some of the most severely affected little people in terms of thinking that life isn't okay. So I think in finishing this, I would like to say that hope is the beginning of a life capable of not being overtaken by the experience and memories of trauma, violence, stress and disintegration. And I think that's probably a good place to end, and I think I've been talking for a long time. So
thank you so much, Angela. That was really interesting, and we've had a lot of fantastic comments come throughout that presentation. So much appreciated.
Sorry. Okay. Are you still there?
Yes.
Okay. So, will I need what will I?
So I've got some questions now, Angela. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. We've had a lot of great questions come through, and we're sadly not going to be able to get to all of them. I just want to note in particular, Tanya C., you've asked a question that we will get back to you with more specifics on, but broadly speaking, you've asked if can frontline workers call the 1800RESPECT helpline for information and advice, and the answer to that is yes. And in relation to some of the specifics of your questions, we will follow up with you. As I said, time has flown, so I'm just going to ask Angela just two questions. One of the questions we've been asked is, recognising the effect that trauma has on the structuring of the brain and on a child's ability to learn, how can the community sector support schools to work with traumatised children?
The community can work with schools by helping schools understand that there's a trauma-informed practice framework that can be applied in educational settings that has the same set of principles that I've spoken about today: predictability, safety, routine, attunement. On the Australian Childhood Foundation website, we've got a resource called Making Space for Learning that is a practice framework for education facilities. So a trauma-informed approach to education is one where we help teachers to understand that children will have trouble learning because of their memory systems, their attentional focus, their ability to connect, their social difficulties, and so in that we can use this same framework to encourage regulation, connection, ways to help children learn in less stressful environments, frameworks to help them remember things with repetition, predictability, routines that help them feel safe, regular people. All of those things are really important in environments of education.
Fantastic. And one last one, and I do want to note we've had a lot of questions, and if you, we will try to get back to as many people with answers to those questions as possible. But if you have some very specific questions you'd like to answer, you can always email feedback@1800respect.org.au. This last question, Angela, is, can children ever truly break out of the cycle of violence?
Yes, definitely. I think children, because we know that the brain is a plastic part of our body, physiological organ. With brain development, it can be reshaped, but it needs to be reshaped in the context of safe regulatory experiences. And that is what children need. They need to have safety, they need protection, they need to do all those things we've talked about, but they will, in the newly experienced safety of relationships, their brains will start to develop again with all the activities around repetition and connection that they need.
Wonderful, Angela. Now, given the time, we are going to have to just get to our closing remarks. That was really wonderful, and I'd like to do a special thank you for everyone that submitted questions. As I said, if you'd like to have any other questions answered, email feedback@1800respect.org.au. Finally, our next webinar is going to be held on Thursday, the 15th of September. The topic is technology facilitated abuse, and that's bound to be a really interesting webinar as well. It'll be presented by Karen Bentley, the National Director of Safety Net Project at WESNET, and you can register now for that by visiting the website or visiting 1800respect.org.au/webinars. There's also a range of resources available to frontline workers by downloading the Frontline Workers Toolkit, available at 1800respect.org.au/toolkit. And to keep up to date with upcoming webinars and new resources, you can subscribe to the newsletter at 1800respect.org.au on the homepage of the newsletter. It's down the bottom of the homepage, bottom of the homepage of our website. You'll find the subscribe link. Now, finally, I just want to raise awareness also of the DAISY app, which is an innovative app that connects women to support services. And recently 1800RESPECT launched the Support a Friend campaign. For more details about how to identify the signs and respond to women at risk of or experiencing domestic and family violence, you can access that short 2-minute video by visiting the homepage of the website and clicking on the banner on the homepage of the 1800RESPECT website. If you stay logged in, you will be taken to an online survey, which will be redirected to now. We appreciate your feedback and comments. And thank you again in advance for your participation, your questions and feedback, and we wish you a very great afternoon. Thank you again.